It is the summer of 1944, and somewhere in a Normandy hedgerow, a British infantryman is lying in the dirt, with something extraordinary in his hands. From the outside, the object looks like a piece of scaffolding that has been involved in a minor industrial accident. It is tubular, brutish, and deeply unglamorous. It has no wood stock, no elegant lines, no craftsmanship to speak of. The barrel does not gleam. The trigger mechanism feels borrowed from something that was already broken. The whole contraption weighs roughly 11 kilograms, roughly the same as a large car battery. And yet the soldier holding it must stay absolutely still, because what is rolling towards him through the dust and the smoke is a German panzer, and this repulsive lump of British engineering is the only thing standing between him and annihilation. He presses the weapon tight against his body. He does not pull a trigger in the conventional sense. He compresses a lever. There is a thud, not a crack or a roar, but a dull, mechanical thud, and then a finned projectile spirals through the air on a curved trajectory and strikes the tank's side armor and the entire principle upon which it operates. A principle so counterintuitive, it was rejected by several senior British officers before ever reaching production. Detonates on contact and punches through steel that a rifle bullet could not scratch. The weapon is the projector infantry anti-tank. The soldiers who carried it called it the Piat. It was never beautiful. It was never sophisticated. It was, by almost every aesthetic measure, the ugliest piece of military hardware fielded by any major power in the Second World War. And it killed more enemy armor at closer range, through more impossible circumstances, than almost any weapon in the British arsenal. This is the story of how a desperate need, a stubborn inventor, and a genuinely peculiar mechanical principle came together to produce one of the most unlikely weapons in modern warfare, and why it mattered more than anyone dared to admit at the time. To understand why the PIAT existed at all, you have to understand the particular horror that German armor inflicted on Allied infantry in the early years of the war. The Panzer III and Panzer IV, which formed the backbone of German armoured strength through North Africa and into the early stages of the Eastern Front, were not invulnerable machines. But to the ordinary infantryman, crouching in a ditch without artillery support, they might as well have been. The rounds from standard infantry rifles simply deflected off the side plating. Mortars required precise trajectories that were almost impossible to achieve against moving targets. Anti-tank rifles, the bolt-action boys' anti-tank rifle, which British infantry carried into the early war, had been designed for a previous generation of light tanks, and by 1941 was already obsolete against the vehicles it was expected to defeat. Against a Panzer IV at anything beyond close range, the boys was functionally useless. The Americans had the bazooka, a rocket-propelled weapon that launched a shaped charged projectile on a stream of burning propellant. It worked up to a point, but the bazooka produced a significant backblast, a jet of flame and gas that erupted from the rear of the weapon upon firing, which meant it could not be used from inside a building, from a confined foxhole, or from the kind of enclosed cover that infantry instinctively sought when armor was approaching. In the claustrophobic lanes of the bocage, or in the shattered buildings of a European city, that limitation was not merely inconvenient. It was potentially lethal. The Germans had the Panzerfaust, a single-shot, disposable weapon of elegant brutality, and the Panzerschreck, a direct copy of the American bazooka. Both were effective. Neither solved the backblast problem. The Panzerfaust in particular demanded that its operator stand in the open, arm extended, and accept a significant probability of burning themselves in the process. What the British Army needed, as it became increasingly clear by 1941 and 1942, was a weapon that could be fired from cover, required no external propellant charge, could penetrate the armor of any tank likely to be encountered, and could be produced in sufficient numbers to equip ordinary infantry platoons. The problem, as engineers at various establishments were discovering, was that no such weapon seemed to be technically possible within the constraints of available British manufacturing. The idea of a rocket-propelled device was dismissed on backblast grounds. The idea of a recoilless rifle required powder charges that were difficult to standardize. Someone eventually suggested a third option, and for a brief, embarrassing period, senior figures in the War Office wished they had never heard of it. The man responsible for the PIAT was Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Blacker, and he had been thinking about spigot mortars for years. Blacker worked at the Directorate of Miscellaneous Weapons Development, an institution whose very name suggests the creative desperation of wartime Britain, and he had already given the world the Blacker Bombard, a spigot mortar for static home defense that looked like something from a nightmare and worked considerably better than its appearance suggested. The spigot mortar principle was old and strange and almost entirely counterintuitive, and Blacker believed it had been unfairly abandoned by mainstream weapons development. He was right. A conventional mortar or gun works by containing an explosive propellant charge in a chamber behind a projectile, igniting it, and allowing the expanding gas to push the projectile forward. The spigot mortar works backwards. Instead of the propellant being behind the projectile is fitted over a fixed rod, the spigot, and the propellant charge sits inside the projectile itself. When the charge fires, it drives the projectile forward off the spigot rather than pushing a projectile from a separate chamber. The entire weapon, in this sense, is simply a platform for positioning the spigot correctly. There is no barrel in the conventional sense, no cartridge case to be ejected, and, critically, no backblast. The propellant gases go forward with the bomb, not rearward into the face of the operator. Blacker's adaptation of this principle for the PIAT produced a weapon of genuinely peculiar character. The device consisted of a large steel tube, roughly 99 centimeters in length, containing a very heavy internal spring, under tension of approximately 90 kilograms, which drove a firing rod forward when released. The operator placed a finned projectile containing both the warhead and a propellant cartridge at the front of the tube. When the spring was released, the rod struck the cartridge, the propellant ignited and drove the bomb forward, and simultaneously, the recoil from the propellant charge drove the spring back into the cocked position, readying the weapon for a second shot. In theory, the bomb itself was a 1.1 kilogram projectile fitted with a shaped charge, what engineers call a hollow charge warhead, designed on the Monroe effect principle. Rather than relying on raw kinetic energy to punch through armor, the shaped charge focused its explosive force into a high-velocity jet of gas and molten metal, concentrated at a single point. Against the armor of a Panzer IV, this jet could penetrate up to 75 millimeters of steel, sufficient to defeat the side and rear armor of virtually any tank in service through the Middle War years. The weapon weighed 14.5 kilograms loaded. It was 99 centimeters long. The spring required to cock it demanded so much physical effort that a soldier who fired the first shot lying down and failed to maintain the correct body position could find himself unable to cock the weapon for a second shot without standing up. A deeply unappealing prospect when a tank was still present. The sights were basic. The effective range in combat was perhaps 100 meters, although the theoretical maximum was 340 meters. At 100 meters against a moving tank with the shaped charge trajectory of a PIAT round, the margin for error was considerable. You had to be steady. You had to be close, and you had to have the nerve to hold your position until the thing was almost on top of you. Production of the PIAT was carried out principally at the Imperial Chemical Industries facility and by a network of subcontractors across the British Midlands, many of whom were producing components for several different weapons simultaneously and had no specific knowledge of what the parts would become. Estimates suggest that somewhere between 115,000 and 130,000 PIATs were manufactured during the war, though precise figures remain difficult to verify, partly because of wartime classification and partly because records from some subcontractors were poorly kept. What is certain is that by mid-1943, the Piat was beginning to reach frontline units in meaningful numbers, and the War Office's reservations were about to be tested in the field. The PIAT's operational debut was not auspicious in the ways its designers might have hoped, but it was instructive. In the invasion of Sicily in July 1943, British and Canadian infantry encountered German armour in the volcanic dust and narrow lanes of the island's interior, and for the first time used the PIAT in the kind of close-quarter, confined environment for which it had been designed. Reports came back that the weapon performed as intended, but also that its operators found it profoundly demanding to use, that the cocking mechanism caused injuries when soldiers failed to maintain position, and that the effective range in combat was substantially less than training had suggested. At 50 to 70 meters, however, it worked. The shaped charge penetrated. Tanks stopped.
In Italy, through the autumn and winter of 1943 and into 1944, the Piat became part of the unglamorous texture of Allied infantry fighting. In the rubble of Ortona, the bloody street battle that Canadian forces fought through in December of 1943, Piats were used to breach walls as much as to destroy armor, the shaped charge detonating against masonry and creating breach points that could be exploited without exposing men to direct fire in the open street. This was an application nobody had designed the weapon for, and it worked with brutal efficiency. In June 1944, in the hours after the D-Day landings, a 19-year-old private in the 6th Airborne Division named Ernest Smith, though the name most associated with extraordinary Piat courage was Sergeant Ernest Alvia Smith of the Seaforth Highlanders of Canada, who would win the Victoria Cross at the Savio River in October 1944, demonstrated what the weapon demanded of the men who carried it. Smith, under direct fire from a self-propelled gun and with infantry attacking from three sides, advanced to within 10 meters of the enemy vehicle and fired. The charge penetrated. Smith then held his position against counter-attacking infantry with a Thompson submachine gun until reinforcements arrived. His citation noted with British understatement that his conduct was courageous in the extreme. It bears emphasizing 10 meters. The Piat required its operator, in the most extreme circumstances, to get within 10 meters of a vehicle weighing 25 tons. The psychological demands of that task are not easily communicated in a documentary script, and precise records of what individual soldiers felt in those moments are naturally sparse. But the testimony that has survived is consistent on one point. The PIAT, for all its ugliness and mechanical peculiarity, was trusted. Men who had used it once and survived were willing to use it again. That in wartime is no small thing. If you are finding this story as remarkable as the weapon itself, a quick subscribe helps the channel more than you might realize. It means more stories like this one can be made. The comparison with German equivalents is illuminating in ways the British Army at the time would perhaps not have wished to acknowledge. The Panzerfaust, in its most common variants, the Panzerfaust 30 and Panzerfaust 60, was in many respects a simpler weapon than the PIAT. It required no cocking, no complex spring mechanism, no particular physical strength to operate. A single soldier could carry several of them. At combat range, the Panzerfaust 60 could penetrate approximately 200 millimeters of armor, significantly more than the Piat's 75 millimeters. It was also, as noted, entirely disposable. The PIAT's advantages were different in kind, rather than degree. The absence of backblast was a genuine tactical superiority in urban and enclosed environments, where the Panzerfaust's prominent fire signature frequently revealed the firer's position and made follow-up shots from cover impossible. The Piat was also reusable, a significant logistical consideration when supply lines were stretched and manufacturing capacity was not unlimited. Its operator could fire from a properly enclosed position and remain concealed. And the PIAT's spring mechanism, bizarre as it was, meant that the weapon produced almost no visible muzzle flash or smoke trail, making it at night or in low visibility considerably harder for enemy tank crews to identify the source of an incoming round. Against the American bazooka, the comparison is similarly nuanced. The bazooka had a longer effective range, approximately 120 meters in combat, and was lighter at around 5.5 kilograms unloaded. Its rocket propulsion gave it a flatter trajectory and somewhat better accuracy at distance. But the backblast problem remained, and in the confined environments of European urban fighting in 1944 and 1945, British commanders consistently reported that the Piat outperformed the bazooka in close-quarter armor engagement, precisely because it could be used from positions where the bazooka simply could not. The Germans, having captured both weapons on various occasions, attempted no direct copy of the Piat. The spigot mechanism was considered too mechanically complex for rapid reverse engineering, and the shape charge technology it used was by that point well understood. The Panzerfaust already exploited the same Monroe effect. What the Piat represented from a German engineering perspective was an interesting solution to a problem they had chosen to solve differently. Both approaches worked. One was elegant, one was the PIAT. Assessing the actual historical impact of the PIAT is a task that requires honesty about the limits of available evidence. The weapon was issued in enormous numbers. Over 100,000 is the most reliable estimate, and was carried by infantry at virtually every level of the Allied order of battle in the Western Theater from 1943 onwards. The number of armored vehicles actually destroyed by Piats is genuinely unknown, because after-action reports were not consistently required to specify the weapon responsible for a kill, and because many engagements in which PIATs were used occurred in conditions of intense combat where detailed recording was impractical. What the after-action reports that do survive suggest is that the PIAT was disproportionately effective in urban fighting and in ambush situations, the context precisely for which it had been designed. The psychological impact may have been as significant as the material one. German tank crews operating in Western Europe after 1943 were aware that any hedgerow, any ruined building, any convenient piece of dead ground could conceal a weapon capable of destroying their vehicle. The PIAT, because it produced no backblast and minimal visual signature, was particularly difficult to spot before it fired. Veterans' testimony suggests that this uncertainty, the knowledge that infantry they couldn't see might be carrying something that could kill them, materially affected the willingness of German armor to operate without infantry support in confined terrain. That effect cannot be quantified, but it was real. The PIAT also influenced post-war thinking about infantry anti-tank weapons in ways that have become somewhat obscured by time. The development of the Carl Gustav recoilless rifle, and later the generation of shoulder-fired anti-tank weapons that succeeded it, drew partly on lessons from PYAT operations about the tactical importance of weapon signature, operator exposure, and the ability to engage from cover. The PIAT's designers had solved a real problem, the backblast problem, in a genuinely novel way, even if the solution was aesthetically peculiar. Later designers solved the same problem differently, but the PIAT's existence demonstrated that the problem was solvable and that the conventional rocket-propelled approach was not the only option available. Surviving PIATs can be found today in several military museums across the United Kingdom. The Imperial War Museum in London holds examples in its collections, and the Tank Museum at Bovington in Dorset has display pieces that allow the weapon's extraordinary ugly bulk to be appreciated in person. Handling one, even inert, even in a museum, is instructive. It is heavier than it looks. The spring mechanism is visible in cross-section displays, and seeing the sheer brute force required to understand how the thing worked goes some way towards explaining why it was carried and used and relied upon by men who must have looked at it on the morning of an assault and felt something between dark amusement and grim respect. Return, then, to that hedgerow in Normandy. The soldier in the dirt is still there. The panzer is still approaching. He is holding 11 kilograms of cocked spring, mild steel, and awkward British pragmatism, and he is about to change the outcome of a small engagement in a war that was decided by thousands of small engagements accumulated over years. There is a useful temptation in histories of military technology to celebrate the weapons that were elegant: the Spitfire, the Hawker Hurricane, the Lee Enfield in its finest configurations. These were things of genuine craft and beauty, and they deserved their reputations. But wars are not decided by elegance. They are decided by solutions to problems that emerge faster than elegant solutions can be designed, approved, manufactured, and distributed. They are decided by men who looked at something that was not beautiful, that was not sophisticated, that was not even comfortable to use, and picked it up anyway because the alternative was to be overrun by something that definitely worked. The Piat was ugly, it was heavy, its cocking mechanism could break a soldier's arm if he tensed at the wrong moment. Its effective combat range was a distance at which the target vehicle was audible, visible, and almost certainly aware of you. It looked, as one British sergeant reportedly described it, like a drainpipe that had been dropped from considerable height. He carried it for 11 months across 3 countries. He used it 3 times in combat. All 3 shots connected. The Germans had better tanks. They had faster tanks. They had, in several categories, more elegant anti-tank weapons. What they could not build in the end was enough of everything. Enough tanks, enough ammunition, enough fuel, enough men willing to hold a position when the Piat round came through the armor and the inside of the vehicle became untenable in the most absolute sense. The Allies built enough of everything, including enough of the ugly things, and the ugly things did their part.